Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. This is another episode with Sam and Hank where we are going through the Church Fathers. Although this episode is a little bit different than some of the other ones, today we are talking about the Emperor Constantine, who I guess by some definitions isn't really a church father, but we both felt that he deserved an episode in his own right, both for his own thoughts and his own the interest in his own theology and his own history, but also for the enormous effect that he had on Christian history. And you really can't understand the Christian history that comes after him without understanding him himself. So even though he's not technically a church father, he is a saint, at least in the Eastern Church, right? Is he a saint in the Catholic Church or no? He's not technically a saint. I would say that that's probably a slightly wiser take on Emperor Constantine. But in any case, I'll just say this right off the bat. Of the people who have had the most influence on Christianity in the world, I think that there's Jesus, who's in his own category, and then there's Constantine, who's in his own category, and then there's basically everyone else. And I think that Constantine could even take on the Apostle Paul in terms of who had the most influence over the course of the church. So this episode, we'll talk some about the history, some about battles and stuff like that. But we also want to dig into what did Constantine actually believe himself? What was the theology of Constantine and the people around him, and what were sort of the immediate effects that he had on Christianity and the church and Christian theology, and then what were those effects down through the ages. So with that said, Hank, tell us a little bit about Constantine.
Well, he was born in 272 AD, lived until about 337 AD, was emperor of the Roman Empire from 306 to 337. His father was the emperor of the West. He was trained in classical Roman thought, and he was also trained by a Christian churchman named Lucius Lantatius.
I think it's Lactantius or something like that.
Lactantius, okay.
But yeah, Lucius Lactantius.
Okay. And who had a big effect on him. He then went to war in the West with his father, and then moved to the East to take over, to fight the Persians in the East. In about 306, when his dad died, he became acclaimed by the army in York and England, and he was victorious. And then as time went on, he killed other emperors and took over the whole
kit and caboodle.
The whole kit and caboodle, the whole empire. For a while, for a long time, it was split. You had multiple emperors, so sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 emperors.
Yeah.
I think we'll discuss. He was a pretty shrewd military man. He was an extremely shrewd politician, extremely shrewd, and we'll get into what he thought about how a society ought to be ordered. He was very into monotheism, and when we think of monotheism, belief in the God of Abraham, Isaac, but he also initially was a monotheistic in Saul, the sun god. So he's important with a lot of reforms. He allowed a lot more freedom in his empire to have disagreements. He has a big effect, and most of us think the Roman Empire ended with the sack of Rome by the Goths, by my forebears, the Germans. And actually, most people who understand the Eastern Church will say, oh no, there was an empire for an additional 1,100 years after the fall of Rome. So Constantine had a huge effect on the spread of Christianity, both East and West, and a huge effect on what church governance looks like in the future, both East and West, either implicitly or explicitly. So that's a little bit about Constantine, and I'm sure we're going to go into a great deal of depth about him.
Yeah, that's a good overview. So some of the background before we've mentioned in a couple episodes sort of the crisis of the 3rd century. In the latter half of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was really falling apart and having a lot of difficulties. This was due to famine. This was due to civil war among the generals and the emperors within the empire. There was also plagues, and Persians and German barbarians were attacking them on multiple fronts, and it almost looked like the whole thing might fall apart. And that was sort of around 270 AD, right? We talked about that when we talked about Paul of Samosata. That was right around that time. And then starting with an emperor named Aurelian, things started to kind of move, Humpty Dumpty started to get put back together again. And a really key figure in putting the Roman Empire back together again is an emperor named Diocletian. And he established what's called the Tetrarchy, that is a rule of 4 people, where in the East there would be an Augustus, and then underneath the Augustus there would be a Caesar, and the Caesar would be the heir apparent of the Augustus. And then in the West, there was also an Augustus who had his Caesar as his underling and heir apparent. And the idea would be that each new Augustus would kind of adopt and pick a son to be their Caesar, and hopefully that would provide some stability to the succession of emperors, because for decades there had been like an emperor almost every year or something like that because of civil wars, assassinations, and coups and things like that. So the Tetrarchy was an attempt at stabilizing the succession plan for emperors. But this split the empire into East and West. And honestly, the division between the Western Church and the Eastern Church, even to this day, is almost exactly along the border drawn up between the East and West by Diocletian. So when we think of the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire, we think of that division based off of Diocletian's splitting into the Tetrarchy. So in the original Tetrarchy, the Caesar, so that's like the second place person in the West, was Constantine's father. Right? So Constantine is growing up in a family that is very closely connected to the rule of the empire. And so that is sort of Constantine's background. Although Constantine is born in Serbia, he spends a lot of time kind of running around in Germany and England, kind of following his father's military campaigns in the West. And then for a time, he was also kind of made a protege of one of the Caesars in the East. So he spends time in what we would call Turkey and Syria and Egypt and stuff like that. But what's interesting is Constantine doesn't spend a lot of time in Rome. Right. And I think that that'll be important later that, in some sense, he's the Roman emperor, but he doesn't have a lot of fealty to the city of Rome itself. He didn't spend a lot of time there. It's not really an important part of his background. So that's sort of, his, he comes from an aristocratic family who's closely connected with power. And even from a young age, he's seen as someone who will likely play some sort of political role in the empire itself. Right. And so his father dies in 306 AD. In York, England, right? We might not think, it seems a little bit weird that they're all the way up in, northern England, but that's where they were at the time. And then when his father dies, Constantine is proclaimed by his father's troops to be the new Caesar, but there's another guy who's claiming to be the new Caesar. The Tetrarchy didn't really seem to work according to Diocletian's plan. He thought that this would be a way to prevent civil wars and have the succession of emperors be a little bit more orderly, but it didn't really work that way. And so Constantine has to defeat multiple rivals really to become his own claimant in the western part of the empire eventually he'll become the Augustus of the West. But I think we should talk a little bit about his kind of philosophical and religious and kind of academic upbringing. You mentioned that he was a follower of Sol Invictus. So Sol Invictus means the unconquered sun or the undefeated sun, right? Like in English we say a football team is undefeated. Invictus means non-conquered or something like that, basically undefeated. So there was this sun god that was sort of a new deity. He was kind of associated with Apollo, but not exactly. And there was sort of a growing cult around Sol Invictus, the Emperor Aurelian, who I mentioned, who started to sort of bring the empire back together. He was one of the first emperors who really dedicated himself to Sol Invictus. And there was a belief that Sol Invictus was in some sense the one true highest god. Right? So instead of there being a polytheism of many gods who are more or less equal with each other and who have children with each other and all sort of the traditional pagan myths, Sol Invictus is seen as sort of the ungenerated source of all things and has a much more monotheistic flair to him. But even if you grow up being taught this sort of philosophical pagan monotheism, you might still do the other sorts of worship ceremonies that the other pagans do. And you could be doing this maybe in a condescending sense, like, oh man, these other silly pagans think these other gods are powerful or exist. But you still probably participate in the ceremonies, unlike Christianity, which is a monotheism that was exclusive enough to not participate in any of the other pagan ceremonies. But it also seems that Constantine the Great was probably raised with some amount of Neoplatonic mystery cults. There's some evidence that he was familiar with Hermeticism. Hermeticism was sort of kind of like a pagan form of Gnosticism, but of a very highly philosophical flavor. So maybe Gnosticism isn't quite the right word, but they believed that there was this prophet named Hermes who had lived in ancient Egypt, who they had the scriptures of, although most people date the origin of Hermeticism to be the 1st or 2nd century AD in Alexandria, Egypt. But there are a lot of weird similarities between Hermeticism and Christianity. They believed in someone named God the Father. They believed God the Father generated a son who could also be called the Logos. They called the Logos the Good Shepherd. And there are some like eerie similarities sometimes between Hermeticism and Christianity. And I think that is a very important part of the story. Like, we don't generally think that there were philosophically monotheistic pagans. We think pagans are polytheists and Christians are monotheists. But Constantine seems to have been mostly raised as something like a highly philosophically oriented pagan monotheist who is very indebted to Neoplatonism and other sort of philosophical ideas at that time.
So what we see is, going back to Lucius, Lucius has a huge impact on Constantine. Many people think Constantine's mother was a Christian.
She certainly was at some point. It's hard to know when exactly that may have changed or not.
Right. And so Constantine starts killing his rivals. So Severus, Galerius,
Maximius.
We'll just call him Max.
Max.
Okay, Mad Max. And in 312, we'll bring this back to you, he has a vision on a bridge.
Or right before a battle on a bridge.
Right.
And there are multiple accounts of this vision, some of them that are slightly at odds with each other. There's sort of two main recounts. Either he was visited by Jesus in a dream, who told him to fight and conquer in Jesus' name. But the more popular version, and the version that I think that more historians give a little bit of weight to, and this is also closely connected to Eusebius's recollection and recounting of the events, is that there was some sort of visionary experience in the sky where there was something like a light or a cross in the sky, and either a voice or writing in the sky that said, "In this sign conquer," and the sign was Chi Rho, right? Basically XR in Greek letters, Chi being X, Rho being R. And it's unclear. I think that later Christians made it seem much more obvious that this was Jesus who was presenting himself to Constantine in this vision. But I think at the time, I'm not sure. It's a little bit unclear if Constantine at the time understood this as a visit from the Christian God or the Christian Messiah, or if he understood it as some more pagan sort of visionary experience. But in any case, what people do seem to agree about is that Constantine had all of his soldiers paint Chi Rho on their shields. And then the reason why he's outside of Rome is that one of his rivals to be the Augustus, the emperor of the West, is in Rome, and Constantine wants to beat him. So Constantine has gathered an army to go attack Rome. And his army is smaller, and, it's always harder to be on offense than defense. But he uses some pretty clever tactics that we won't go into. There are videos that you can go watch about this. But he basically lures his opponent out of the city by making his force seem even weaker than it is, and then surprise ambushes him with the full size of his force. And his opponent, Maxentius, dies in literally the river Tiber on a bridge. And Constantine is victorious and then enters the city as the now unrivaled emperor of the West. But there's still emperor of the East at this point. So this is 312 AD, and Constantine has finally beaten a series of rivals to be the uncontested emperor of the western part of the empire. And he has done this because of a religious vision, and he heeded this religious vision and won a underdog battle. And I think that there are multiple times in Constantine's life where he seemingly has religious visions or prophecies or revelations or whatever, or spiritual experiences, however you want to put that. And he seems to be the sort of person who took these things very seriously. I think that there's some people out there who say that, Constantine, he sort of faked the religious thing, or this was just propaganda to back up, his successes, or this was just a way of getting the people to like him. But I don't find any of those sort of more cynical or more skeptical takes to be very credible. I think that Constantine was a very religious person who was very motivated by a sense of divine and by theology. And I think that he viewed himself as, in some sense, called by God to a very special mission. And I think that this was true even while he was a pagan and in the transitionary period where it's kind of hard to say if he's a pagan or a Christian, and later in his more overtly Christian phase, that he was a man who felt plucked by destiny and by fate and by God to be something great and something important, and that he always attributed his success to his piety and the fact that he listened to what God told him to do. And that you can see this here at what's one of the most important points in his career is this. It's called the Battle of Milvian Bridge, where he defeats his enemy right outside the gates of Rome itself to be the emperor of the western half.
And then a year later, I think he does an edict, right?
Yes, so he issues the Edict of Milan, just, not too long after winning that battle and consolidating his power in the West. And so another thing that we didn't totally mention is that Diocletian, who had established the Tetrarchy and who Constantine had known, he was one of the most intense persecutors of Christianity. And the Diocletian persecution, which lasts from sort of like the 290s through the early 300s, was the most intense in terms of body count persecution that Christianity ever endured. Because Diocletian thought that part of the reason why the Roman Empire was weaker than it should be is because there were all these Christians who weren't worshiping the gods correctly, and the gods were mad at the Christians. And so he institutes a very severe persecution that was very widely carried out, that probably killed many thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even more than that Christians, and made life difficult for those who weren't killed. Right. But Constantine's father, probably somewhat influenced by his propensity towards monotheism, had always taken a softer stance towards Christianity than Diocletian and some of Diocletian's underlings, who were intense persecutors. And I think Constantine had learned to have a soft spot for Christianity from an early age. Again, I think the connection with monotheism is probably part of it. But I also think that Constantine noticed that the Diocletian persecution in some sense wasn't very successful, because Christianity was very resilient against persecution. And while the persecution did probably weaken and lower Christianity's numbers, it still had a certain resistance and vibrancy in the face of it. And I think one of Constantine's lessons was like, persecutions don't work as well as you think they will. You can't really force people in matters of religion and deep conscience. And there's sort of a theme throughout Constantine's career of what we would almost recognize as something for an appreciation of the freedom of religion. And the Edict of Milan in 313 does not make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. It does not outlaw paganism. It does not outlaw pagan sacrifice or any of those sorts of things. It just makes Christianity, for the first time, a legal religion of the Roman Empire. And, Judaism had long been a legal religion. Various paganisms had long been legal religions. Christianity had been illegal up until this point, and it just finally makes it legal. And, he also says that some of the property that had been taken from them during the persecution needs to be returned to them, and that maybe they get some tax breaks and some other financial goodies too. But that all of that was sort of on a par of what other religions had already experienced up until this time, although there's some signs that Constantine is starting to play some favoritism towards Christianity, even from this relatively early period. But the Edict of Milan is a very important milestone in Christianity. It is the first time that they are free from persecution, because, persecution had kind of been an on and off thing. It's not the case that Christianity had been under a constant, unending, relentless persecution from early times. It sort of ebbed and flowed, where there would be long periods of peace where the Romans kind of left it alone, and then times where they would get mad at it and persecute it. But even in the best of times, it was technically an illegal religion, and that made its life difficult in numerous ways. And Constantine is the first time that those ways are taken away and reversed.
And so now we get into, he opens up Pandora's box.
Yeah.
Because the disagreements within Christianity were under the, when you're persecuted, you hang together, right? Okay. You could be, you understand that if you don't hang together, there's going to be larger problems. Now, what's interesting during this time, right? And I want to stop here. When I hear people talk about, certain issues that Christians seem to agree on mainly are not in the creeds. Creeds are developed based on disagreements. The Nicene Creed is based on a disagreement with biblical Unitarianism and Arianism, okay? That's the Nicene Creed, which wasn't really created at the Council of Nicaea. It evolved. But the idea is that if I run a company and I put together a statement of vision, I'm saying, here's what I focus on as important. Doesn't mean that other things are not important, but you cannot put in 100 million items like a laundry list. It's got to be focused. So what occurs? Our friend, the emperor, thinks, I've done a great thing. Until all of a sudden, the huge Arian controversy breaks out almost right away.
Right. There were seemingly numerous controversies that had been kept at least somewhat pacified by, like you said, the shared sense of persecution. And then once these things are gone, and we covered this in greater detail in our previous episode about Arius, and the Arian controversy is certainly at the center of Constantine's early interactions with Christianity. And I guess we should say sort of over from about 313, which is the Edict of Milan, through 324, the Emperor Constantine still, he's gotten rid of his rivals in the West, but he still has rivals in the East. And there's a series of battles and stuff like that where he, kills somewhat ruthlessly his rivals to eventually, he is the sole emperor in 324. And there hadn't been a single powerful, united, sole emperor like Constantine who really had a good military control over the whole empire in quite a while. And this is really one of the first times that all of Humpty Dumpty is back together again, that Rome seems ascendant. It seems to have its act back together. The military is in good cooperation with the emperor. The military has a good sense of morale and identity and doesn't seem to want to bite Constantine in the back Constantine is one of those leaders who had been in a lot of battles. He was in the trenches with a lot of his soldiers, and he was a military man himself, so the military had a lot of respect for him. But he wasn't just one of those generals who killed the emperor so that he could become emperor. He had a pedigree that sort of enabled him to be something greater than just a military person. So eventually Constantine unites the Roman Empire under himself, like I said, in a way that hadn't been done in a long time. And this is one of the main reasons why one of the multiple reasons why Constantine deserves to be called Constantine the Great. But during this period, various problems in the Christian church are emerging. I think that my friend Keegan Chandler makes this point. So Keegan Chandler is one of my biblical Unitarian friends who sort of is his own kind of hobby historian and theologian. I interviewed him on my channel. He wrote a book about Constantine that was very influential in my thoughts on Constantine. And he makes the point that one of Constantine's main motivations is that he believes in what's called the story that's called the decline of monotheism narrative, where once upon a time in the early days of humanity, all humans were monotheists, right? And everyone worshipped the one true God, and they did it without idols, and they did it without animal sacrifice. There was this sort of pure monotheistic worship. But then over the course of history, humans divided from each other. They started having a multiplicity of gods. They started making idols with their own hands to these gods. And that this evil and bad and multiplice worship was part of what caused humanity to constantly be at war with itself, was disagreements about these gods. And that if you could get rid of polytheism and reorient humanity back towards the one true God, then you could restore sort of the original unblemished state of humanity. And if you could do this in the empire, it would unite the empire in a way that it had always struggled to be united. And because one of Constantine's main drives and main struggles is there is this divided empire that he wants to unite into one thing. And he, in many ways, see this as parallel to there's polytheism that has a divided attention and divided allegiances and divided religious devotions. And if you could unite it to orient towards monotheism, that the monotheism of the religion would be parallel to the unity of the empire, and it would unite it into one thing. And so I think, and this is, I think, a vision that he had for himself before he was a Christian, that he would be the person to unite the Roman Empire into a monotheism. But you still need a particular monotheism to do it, right? And his philosophical pagan monotheism was sort of an elite sport that only some very philosophically educated people cared about. And Judaism he didn't like, I think because I think he viewed them as having killed the Messiah, and that made them somewhat accursed from God. So he doesn't like Judaism as a possible monotheism. And Christianity looks like a promising form of monotheism. Maybe Christianity could be the monotheism that unites the empire. And Christianity, it's important to say that at the Edict of Milan, Christianity was probably only 10% of the empire. So some people who think that Constantine is favoring Christianity for political reasons, well, it's an odd choice if that's what he's trying to do, because Christianity is a minority. Christianity is even more of a minority in the elite parts of the empire among, the aristocracy and the leaders of the empire, especially because the Diocletian persecution has basically purged all Christian leadership from the empire. So it's not like Christianity is this dominant force, but I think he sees within Christianity the potential to be the monotheism that he's looking for.
I would say instead of that, he favored Christianity for political reasons. He chose to bring Christianity up partially for political reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So great leaders throughout the years, right, have realized that if you do not have one thing to focus your people on, you start having problems with fragmentation. And so Constantine saw that and said, what has the Roman Empire had for 100 years? Fragmentation. Generals killing each other, right? Okay, this god's forefronted, now this god's forefronted. Onward and upward. And this is what I mean by he's a shrewd politician. He understands that there's got to be a focus of one god in the empire where there's a common agreement. But I can't force it because I've seen what happened when you try to force things. It doesn't work. But what we see is he was the highest status person of his time. He becomes a Christian. What happens? Other people follow. Okay. Well, if this is good enough for Oprah, it's good enough for me. Now, we can see that his vision turned out to be correct. In the Eastern Empire, it turned out to be very correct. It adhered for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And even in the Western Empire, even though there's fragmentation, right, what did we have? We started having the Holy Roman Emperor. The Pope figured out, let's bring Charlemagne into the game, and he can run the whole Western part of the empire. Under, of course, my benevolent, loving rule. Societies work better. So I'm talking now on a practical basis, not on a religious basis. Societies work better when there's one thing to focus on. And what we've seen is the American society for 150 years worked fairly well. And now it's not working so well. And you'll hear people saying it was a Christian nation. Not overtly, in the sense that everybody who was in the country was Christian. But people who may have truly believed in a Christian theology, but you had other people that at least mouthed the platitudes, and as Tom Holland would say, actually were Christians even if they didn't know it. And it works out for justice, for fair dealing, and things of that nature. And I think what Constantine saw is what we're seeing today. When you have a fragmentation, you have a disordered society that distrusts each other and is constantly at each other's throats and doesn't work.
Yeah. And he like we said earlier, even though he's trying to unite the empire into a new monotheistic religion, he doesn't do it with force and the tip of a sword. He does it through, he very much believes that the truth is reasonable and that reason is its own form of persuasion, and that all of the previous attempts at religious coercion were at best unsuccessful and maybe even backfired on themselves, right? And he's thinking mainly of the persecution of Christianity, which didn't succeed in wiping out Christianity. And so he really wants the people of the empire to have a sense of freedom to come to the truth. And he believes that when given the freedom and given the opportunity to use reason, that they will see the reasonableness of monotheism and the reasonableness of the religious reforms that he is enacting, and that he won't need to use compulsion. He can use people, the better angels of people's nature, to have a softer form of coercion, a unity through soft power rather than a unity of religion through hard power.
Well, as a Catholic Christian, I believe that the more you delve into the faith, the more that you actually do use your reason. It's so Constantine is someone that you could understand. He understands certain predicates. Now, what's interesting, as he's involved in all these disagreements, and he doesn't like them. By the way, he is not happy with any of these church disagreements. It's like, I thought I resolved the problem, and these pesky bishops are coming to me with who's this Alexander? Who's this Arius? What the heck is going on around here? Let's get together, right? So he calls a huge council. It is his summer home, wasn't it?
Yeah. So, so like you said, and like we've said already, one of the main reasons why he's sort of anointing Christianity with his favor is because he is entrusting it with the task of bringing about religious unity and monotheistic devotion in the empire. But what is frustrating that desire is that there are divisions and arguments and disputes within Christianity, which he didn't really know about and which weren't entirely obvious until you took the lid off of the persecution. But one of the biggest of these arguments is the Arian controversy brewing down in Alexandria, Egypt. And nowadays we can see in hindsight that the Arian controversy was way bigger and had way deeper roots than was obvious. But he thought, okay, I'll pull all these bishops together, right? We'll have a big council, a bigger council than they've ever been able to have. And in this council, we'll just, we'll talk it through, right? I believe in reason. I believe in persuasion. I believe if you give people the benefit of the doubt that they'll come to see the light of the truth. So we'll have a non-coercive council. This council will bring a resolution to the Arian controversy and a couple other lingering controversies and questions that the church has. And then from there on, we'll be, honky-dory in the clear. We'll have a unified church. And, it'll then have the unity that I'm hoping for. And all we need to do is to trust in the process of dialogue and reason and persuasion to bring this about. And so this is part of this is his motivation for calling the Council of Nicaea. And it is Constantine who calls the Council of Nicaea. So we'll talk a little bit more about him founding Constantinople in a second, after we talk about the council. But the reason why it's in Nicaea is that Constantinople, the new capital, is still under construction at this point in time. He had originally wanted to have it in Constantinople as a way of sort of almost like inaugurating the city or something like that. But construction is behind schedule. It's an easy thing to understand. And so he has it at his summer home, which is only about a day or two's, hike from Constantinople. It's like a lake home, a summer home, kind of near Constantinople. And so he has it at his summer residence. And there had been church councils before, right? We've talked about councils in Antioch, councils in Egypt, and various things like that. But for the most part, they had either been local or at best somewhat regional, right? And maybe we're talking on the order of a couple dozen bishops or something like that. It's hard to know for sure, but this is the first time, and Constantine sends invitations throughout the empire to bishops, and he says that, oh, by the way, show this letter to whoever you need. Transportation's free, get on some boats, make your way. At first it says to Constantinople, and then he has to edit his invitations and says actually come to Nicaea. And there was actually some people who got lost and never made it to Nicaea because they didn't get the updated invitation. But anyway, so I think that the general consensus is that it's somewhere between about 200 and 300 bishops come to the Council of Nicaea. And I think, Hank, you and I are going to have an entire episode on the Council of Nicaea. That might even be our next episode. So we don't maybe need to go into too much detail on this, but it's still important for the story of Constantine. And so, a couple hundred bishops gather, although I'll mention that the Bishop of Rome does not seem to have been there. It's mainly Greek-speaking bishops from the eastern half of the empire, from places like Turkey and Egypt and Syria and those sorts of places. And one of the main items on the agenda is solving this dispute between Arius, who is a priest in Alexandria, and Alexander, who is the bishop of Alexandria. And both Arius and Alexander are there, as well as many of their allies and supporters. So all the bishops sort of gather, and then kind of on the first day of proceedings, Constantine the Great sort of waltzes in, and he is in his full purple getup, the full dress to the nines as the Roman emperor, like all of the garments that you could possibly use to make yourself look big and important. And so he waltzes in as obviously the emperor, and then he asks the bishops if he can have a seat. He asks them, do you mind if I sit in and listen? And of course they say yes. But you can imagine there's this weird sort of tension that isn't entirely resolved so who's in charge of this thing? Is Constantine in charge of this thing? After all, he sent out the invitations. We are at his house, literally. And he's the emperor, as he just reminded us by wearing his giant purple robe. But yet this is a church council. And so Eusebius of Caesarea seems to be more or less in charge, and, a couple of the bishops seem to be running the show. But Constantine is there, and Constantine isn't silent. We know that Constantine voiced his opinions on things, but he's not directing it either. And he's also clear that he's not a bishop himself. It's not like he's equal to one of the bishops. He has a different role, but he doesn't have a silent role. And so this tension between imperial authority and church authority isn't exactly resolved and isn't exactly clear, but it's clear that they're separate, but that they're intermingled. And all of this is going on. And so there's this dispute between Arius and Alexander, and the central question is how exactly is the Son of God related to God the Father? Is the Son of God eternal, the same way God the Father is? Is the Son of God equally divine as God the Father is? Or is Son of God, generated at a certain point in time? And is he maybe a lesser grade of divinity? Does the Son of God fully reveal all of God's divinity? Or is God's divinity in some sense so transcendent that we can't really see it in Jesus? It's like, those are the sort of questions that are on the table. And so Constantine, there's some mixed reports about who introduced the word homoousios at the Council of Nicaea. So homoousios means same substance, right? And Arius is previously on the record as having said that the Father and the Son are not the same substance. And this word homoousios, one of the places that we find it the most often used is in Hermetic literature, right? Hermeticism is that pagan Gnostic mystery monotheistic cult that I mentioned. They often use the word homoousios to describe the relationship between the Father and the Son in their theology. And so Constantine is listening to this disagreement. Okay, some people think that the Father and the Son are different. Some people think that they're kind of more similar to each other. And so it is the best reports that we have is that Constantine himself suggests, well, how about we say that the Father and Son are homoousios? And I think that the Christians had previously viewed this word with suspicion because it had sort of this Gnostic origin to it. And they had viewed it with suspicion because Paul of Samosata had used this word to say that, God's word and God's spirit, they're not different persons. They're one with God, right? They're homoousios with God. So he had used it in a Unitarian sense, right? To say that the Son isn't a separate person.
Which destroy any language. Go ahead.
Right. So there's this bad taste in a lot of Christians' mouths towards the word homoousios, but Constantine, perhaps not knowing all the subtleties of this history, says, how about we say homoousios as a way to describe the relationship? And Constantine also suggests that you can understand this word in your own sense. I think that Constantine views this word as an opportunity for people to somewhat, because it's not obvious what the word means. Homoousios, same substance. You can kind of interpret it in different ways. And I think Constantine views that as an advantage. I think he's trying to use this word to bridge the two different camps, right? Because his constant goal is unity, 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 right? Okay, maybe we need to excommunicate Arius and a couple of his buddies, but we'll let them back into communion in a couple of years, right? We'll slap them on the wrist, right? And we'll unite the two different camps, the pro-Arian camp and the anti-Arian camp, with this word homoousios, which is vague enough for each of them to kind of agree with it, even though neither side really likes it. Right. And hey, also, maybe it's a way for pagan monotheists to feel like Christianity is also preaching the same truth that they already believed in. Right. So it has kind of this syncretic quality of blending pagan and Christian theology in a way that will help the pagans who are not liking Constantine's embrace of Christianity, help them come on board too. And, it has kind of all of those features to it. And so I think it really was Constantine who introduced the word homoousios, which is in the Nicene Creed to this day, and all the various church traditions that recite the Nicene Creed. When you say the Father is consubstantial, right? I think that's normally how it's...
Consubstantial with the Son is consubstantial with the Father.
Well, you have Constantine himself to thank for that particular turn of phrase being in the Creed.
Now we'll talk to something I know a little bit about, which is political genius, because that's political genius right there, okay? In essence, what he's doing is the art of compromise right in front of you. Let's find a way. By the way, nobody's going to be completely happy with my compromise, but then he understood a word, one word. I said, let's throw that in here. Now, that drove both the Arians crazy and people like Athanasius crazy, right?
Right.
They did not like it at
Athanasius
all.
also did not particularly like the word homoousios, at least at first, for the
Yeah.
record.
So Eusebius, right, of course, is another politician of high rank because, oh, no, they did exactly what I wanted them to do at the council, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, they didn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But what you had this fig leaf, a huge fig leaf. By the way, one word changes how now changes the theology. It gives a trajectory to my side, which is Trinitarian theology. Of course, what we find today in the United States, at least in the West, is that half the people that say they're Christian, whether they're Catholic or evangelical, don't believe in that the Son is consubstantial with the Father.
Well, the problem is they read their Bibles, but yeah.
Yeah, no. They what
Well,
happens?
that's another part of this word is that it's not in the Bible,
What
right?
happens is in Scripture, we read the Father and the Son. And when we always think of the Father and the Son, we always think of a hierarchy. And the hierarchy is the Father's on top, the Son is, and of course, Jesus says that all I have, I've given up to the Father, which I would say implies that if he didn't give it up, he's equal, but he gave it up freely as showing sacrifice, showing discipline, showing the ability to be obedient. So this is an amazing thing about Constantine. And I think an amazing thing, as I read the same book that you read, think of a guy who comes in the all purple, right? I mean, he's a peacock. Well, you might have underestimated him. And then all of a sudden he goes, out of nowhere, why don't we use this word here? Right? And that word there changes everything for the next 1,700 years. Everything.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And it's still there. It's one of Constantine's most enduring monuments, I guess you could say.
Well, yes. And how many people really know that Constantine was the guy that put consubstantial in the Nicene Creed?
I don't think too many people. I think that there are a lot of people who like to downplay Constantine's influence on theology because nowadays a mix of church and state sort of makes us uncomfortable. And I think that there's people who also know that Constantine has this sort of weird halfway pagan, halfway Christian phase, and they want to downplay any sense that Constantine's paganism background might have had some influence on Christian theology. And I think so that some people like to say, oh, no, Constantine didn't have any effect on the Nicene Creed. It was just the churchmen and the bishops. But I don't think that that's very true.
The great leaders of antiquity and even through were not just great military men, they were great thinkers. They were taught to be thinkers. Okay? Charlemagne, who became the first Holy Roman Emperor, right, was a man who spoke multiple languages, who understood philosophy and theology, who wanted more people in the empire to become literate, thought they should read. Okay, well, we in our country have bifurcated thought from action. We're Gnostic. You know, I read a few years ago Patton's letters to his wife. Patton was a crazy guy in a lot of ways, but he wasn't a stupid guy, and he understood philosophy and theology and history because it was embedded in how you were taught. You were taught because to understand how to act, how to treat people, you had to understand the historical antecedents of where you came from. And we sort of, in the last 50 years, have really said, no, history starts when I'm born. Okay? And so Constantine was taught by Lucius, who is a very good theologian.
Mm-hmm. Although
Okay.
Lucius, another thing that I probably should have said earlier about Lucius Lactantius, his Constantine's Christian tutor, was the sort of Christian who often emphasized the similarities between paganism and Christianity and highlighted the eternal truths that both religions shared in common, right? Some Christians that we've encountered before like to draw hard and fast lines, right, between Christianity and paganism, right? Like Justin Martyr, when he's writing his apology to the emperor, he doesn't hold any punches in differentiating Christianity from paganism. But Lucius Lactantius was sort of like I think that Lucius also knew that Constantine was maybe a way to change the course of Christian history and was sort of gently nudging him in a way that Constantine was receptive to, of saying, hey, the greatest thoughts in paganism and the greatest thoughts in Christianity are really pretty similar to each other. And, instead of like this constant animosity, maybe we can find the true common ground between them. And it almost has sort of like a perennialist coexisty kind of, some philosopher, some really highly philosophical religionists, whether pagan or Christian, will often say, the eternal truths in all the religions are basically the same, and I can see that they're basically the same thing from my, philosophical pedestal, and that they need to stop fighting each other, and that there's this sort of perennialist kind of syncretic tendency from some sort of people. And Lucius has a little bit of that in him. And I think Constantine very much believed that idea that paganism and Christianity, when they were at their best, were basically saying the same eternal truths.
Well, I mean, we had someone who wrote a book 80 years ago called The Abolition of Man. C.S. Lewis basically posited the same thing, right? The Tao. Mm-hmm. That there's basic agreements. Now, I don't want to be unfair to Lewis because he would eventually, and not eventually, before that would say that, however, there's agreements, there's a hierarchy and Christianity's on top. And I think what's funny about Constantine is you see there's agreements, but eventually he says, okay, Christianity's on top.
But it takes a while. I think it takes about 20 or 30 years for him to go from, Christianity and paganism are kind of more or less equally true to maybe Christianity is the truth.
He was growing in the faith.
He was growing in. I think that's a fair thing to say. I don't think that's a cynical thing either. People are allowed to change and evolve and grow over time. But I think the idea that Constantine was pagan, and then all of a sudden he had a vision of Jesus at Milvian Bridge, and ever thereafter he was a perfectly faithful Christian. I don't think that's true. I think that there is much more of an overlap period of Constantine where he is kind of both pagan and Christian, almost kind of at the same time, because he thinks that they're kind of basically the same.
Well, that would only make political and historical sense, because he's got this big, huge empire, right? Everybody forgets after 9/11, George W. Bush was basically saying that Islam and Christianity could coexist, and they had a lot of agreement together. And why was he doing that? Because he did not want to see a persecution of one people over another people in his country. Mm-hmm. Okay? Still happened, but the position of a leader is how can we synchronize things, okay?
Yeah.
Because the Roman Empire was a huge empire, right? The United States is a huge country. This isn't like a small country of 5 million people like Liechtenstein, where you could have one thing basically. You're all the way at you're near Persia, all the way up to England. You have a huge diversity of beliefs, and somehow you have to have some kind of synchronicity to have those beliefs interact so that your empire doesn't fall apart. Because one thing that will create an empire falling apart very quickly is religious disagreements.
Yeah. So I want to read a quote. And so this is this is a quote from Constantine himself, and this is probably the speech that he gave at the closing of the Council of Nicaea. Some people think that he's actually giving this at a different occasion, but I think that this is probably his speech to kind of summarize and encapsulate the Council of Nicaea. And he's giving this to the bishops. And so this is, it's called it's sometimes called the Oration of Constantine. But so here he said, this is making the point of what I'm saying about how he views Christianity and paganism as being pretty similarly true. We ought, therefore, to aim at objects which are within our power and exceed not the capacities of our nature. For the persuasive influence of argument has a tendency to draw most of us away from the truth of things, which has happened to many philosophers who have employed themselves in reasoning and the study of natural science, and who, as often as the magnitude of the subject surpasses their powers of investigation, adopt various devices for obscuring the truth. Right? He's trying to explain why the different pagan philosophers disagree with each other, right? Sometimes they've accidentally followed falsely persuasive arguments in different paths, right? So this is also similar, right? There's one truth, but people keep falling away from it, sort of thing, right? So he's talking about the various philosophers. And hence their diversities of judgment and contentious opposition to each other's doctrines, and this notwithstanding their pretensions to wisdom. Hence, too, popular commotions have arisen, and severe sentences passed by those in power, apprehensive of the overthrow of hereditary institutions, have proved destructive to many of the disputants themselves. Socrates, for example, elated by his skill in argumentation, indulging his power of making the worse appear the better reason, and playing continually with the subtleties of controversy, fell a victim to the slander of his own countrymen and fellow citizens. Right? So he's kind of going through the Hall of Fame of philosophers. Socrates got in trouble for having, it being too persuasive sometimes. Pythagoras, too, who laid special claim to the virtues of silence and self-control, was convicted of falsehood, for he declared to the Italians that the doctrines which he had received during his travels in Egypt, and which had long before been divulged by the priests of that nation, were a personal revelation to himself from God. So this is interesting. This is a very common thing in Neoplatonism, that the true eternal truths had originally been discovered in Egypt, and that Pythagoras had traveled to Egypt and learned these eternal truths and brought them to Greek philosophy. This is not something that's in the historical record. This is sort of like a Neoplatonic myth, so you can see him echoing that Neoplatonic myth that Pythagoras had learned truths from Egypt, but he claimed that they were revelations to himself. All right. It's going to get juicy, I promise. This is going to get even more interesting and relevant. Lastly, Plato himself, the gentlest and most refined of all, first essayed to draw men's thoughts from sensible to intellectual and eternal objects, and taught them to aspire to sublimer speculations. In the first place, declared with truth a God above every essence, but to him he added also a second, distinguishing them numerically as two, though both possessing one perfection, and the being of the second God proceeding from the first. So he's talking about how Plato taught that there was one God who was transcendent and above sensory perception, and that this first God generates a second God. This second God, right, is a phrase that we have heard in many church fathers before, but he's not citing scripture or the church fathers for this idea. He's citing Plato, right? And he literally calls the second God a second God. For he is the creator and controller of the universe and evidently supreme, while the second, as the obedient agent of his commands, refers the origin of all creation to him as the cause. In accordance, therefore, with the soundest reason, we may say that there is one being whose care and providence are over all things, and God the Word, who has ordered all things. But the Word, being divine himself, is also the Son of God. For by what name can we designate him except the title of Son, without falling into the most grievous error? For the Father of all things is properly considered the Father of his own word. Thus far, then, Plato's sentiments were sound. So is he describing Christian theology, or is he describing Platonic philosophy? He says that they're the same, right? And that there is this one high transcendent God, God the Father and maker of all things. That's the monotheos, right? He doesn't say that the Son and the Father are one God together. The monotheism is God the Father, who is this supreme high God, and then the supreme high God generates a second God, his words, and Plato's words, and the Nicene Creed's implied theology is that there's the second. This is Constantine summarizing the Council of Nicaea at the Council of Nicaea, and so there's the second God as Plato taught, right? Not as scriptures teach, not as church fathers teach, but as Plato teaches. All right, and let's see here. I think that I'll go a little bit further. And this has given occasion to still greater error among the unthinking portion of mankind, who pay no regard to the providence of the supreme God, but worship images of their own devising, made in the likenesses of men and other living beings. Hence it appears that the transcendent nature and admirable learning of this philosopher, tinged as they were with some such errors as these, were by no means free from impurity and alloy. And yet he seems to me to retract and correct his own words when he plainly declares that a rational soul is the breath of God and divides all things into two classes, intellectual and sensible. So he's saying Plato is a little bit wrong about there being multiple gods, but maybe he corrects himself by saying that there is the intellectual world and the sensible world. So he's basically saying Plato is mostly right. Maybe he's a little bit wrong about some of the polytheism, but maybe that was people misunderstanding him, and maybe he's actually right. And you can see in here Constantine's own theology, which whether or not it's a correct classification of Plato's theology is a fair question, but there is one supreme almighty God who begets a second God, his Son, the Logos, and it really is the same thing as Paul Vanderklay's God number one and God number two divide, right? God number one, transcendent, holy, 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 right? Far above everything. We can't interact with him directly. But then there's the Son of God, who is a subordinate agent who does God the Father's will, who we can interact with our intellectual perception. And so this is Constantine's theology, and I would say this is the theology of the original Nicene Creed. Not that the Father, Son, and Spirit are one God together, Trinity and unity, unity and Trinity, or something like that. But there's one God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, as it says in the first sentence. And then there is his only begotten Son, who is a second God, subordinate to the first God. Same substance, yes. Eternal, yes. But not the same God, right? It's a second God.
Nay.
And this is the same thing that Plato teaches, right?
Well, I mean, we've been for a year and a half now going over the early church fathers, right? And we really haven't named the name of Plato, who actually informed most of those early church fathers. I mean, whether it was St. Justin Martyr, Athenagorius. I mean, if you were a Origen, Plato was just part of what you swam in that time, and Neoplatonism, right? I mean, I think that we could say that Greek philosophy had a huge impact on Christian theology. It still does.
And Constantine's point is that they're saying the same thing, right? This is the sort of syncretism of paganism and Christianity.
They're sort of saying the same thing. Okay.
Right. He does criticize Plato a little bit, but then he says, but maybe
they're sort of saying the same thing. Because what a Trinitarian would say is that God is unified in love. And I still go back to what when we spoke about origin, that the best way to think of the Trinity is God is fully God, but he's not the Son and he's not the Holy Spirit. The Son is fully God, but he's not God the Father or God the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit is God, but he's not the Son and he's not the Father, but they're unified.
Yeah, but that way of talking isn't around yet. For Constantine,
Origin talked that way.
well, for Origen and Constantine and Eusebius and all the other people at this time, the one true God was God the Father. There was no God that was like all three of them together.
Let's be clear. I would say right now that most people would say God, when we say God the Father, right? Okay. That when we pray, Jesus is bringing his petitions as the great high priest to God the Father. Okay.
Sounds good to me.
Now hold on there. Let's slow down there, Cotton. Okay. The idea is we are limited, so we have to see. Again, I'm going to go back to origin. We have to see things metaphorically. So when we pray, we're praying in metaphors at times because that's how we see things. We can't see the idea that we can apprehend reality as is foolish. I mean, Peterson himself does a great job explaining you can't see reality as is. We see meaning. And so the meaning that we see, at least as Christians, is we see that the Holy Spirit is in us, praying prayers through the Son to the Father in groanings that cannot be understood by us. Okay? And that gives us a reasonable way of interacting with the ineffable, invisible God, right? That, I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of criticism. I can't wait for Anselman and Jacob to get on here and really lay me out. But I stand with this. It's metaphor. And I think what's happened is the Reformation made a huge mistake 500 years ago by tossing out origin. Implicitly, not explicitly, but the way Scripture, by the way, watch what Jonathan Pageau's saying. We kicked this way out, and now the problem is it's so hard to understand going back to the way that people thought. And it worked for, not thought, but it worked and gave them a better understanding of what reality and God is. We've thrown out God number one and we kept God number two. Or we've thrown out God number two, but we've kept God number one.
Well, you tried to make God number one and God number two the same God. that would be Constantine's complaint. And my point is at the Council of Nicaea, there are no formal Trinitarians in the sense that we mean the word today. And I think that will shock people because people are often taught that at the Council of Nicaea, the Trinity was decided once and for all. But I don't think that that is really very accurate at all. I think that the theology at that time was that there was this one chief transcendent God who is God the Father Almighty. He generated and caused to exist his Son. And the argument was whether this was at a point in time and whether their divinities were of different kinds. But both sides would have more or less agreed with this second God language, right, that the Logos, the Son, is the second God who is subordinate to the Father and does his will and is sort of his agent going around accomplishing the will of the Father while the Father sits back and proudly watches.
Well, it took another 80 years for this to work out. That's at the beginning, right? We said that the Nicene Creed, as we know today, wasn't developed.
Right. The Nicene Creed that you recite today is actually from the Council of Constantinople, which is in 381, but it has a lot of the language rooted in the Council of Nicaea, and like 2/3 of it or more is the words from the Council of Nicaea, but some other stuff was edited and changed and added.
The Nicene Creed was perfected at the Council of Constantinople.
Well, I mean, another thing that I'll say is that a lot of times there's this perception, especially maybe among Protestants, that Constantine rammed theology and Christianity down people's throats with the force of the empire and the point of a sword and all of that sort of stuff. But that really wasn't Constantine. There is a later emperor named Theodosius the Great, who is much more the boogeyman that people think that Constantine was, whereas Constantine wasn't that boogeyman. Constantine really did believe in freedom of religion, and that when given the opportunity to have freedom of choice and think about these things, that people will eventually come to the right conclusion, and that we need to create space for that to happen, and that we will allow the wisdom of monotheism to emerge, and that will unite the empire. And that that the Council of Nicaea was an attempt to unite the church such that it could be the vehicle for the unification of the religious practices of the empire towards monotheism, and in some sense be a bridge and a fusion where pagans and Christians could come together and recognize their shared truths. But I should say, to give Constantine some credit, he does talk about Jesus being crucified and how that is offensive to people, but it's actually because they don't understand it. And he talks about the crucifixion in ways that, honestly, I was getting choked up talking about it, just thinking about the Christian emperor acknowledging the wisdom of Jesus being crucified. So I don't want to say that he's a complete syncretist and that he doesn't show any favoritism towards Christianity, because he does talk about specifically Christian ideas, and especially the importance of Jesus himself and Jesus' crucifixion. And he talks about the importance of the incarnation. He also calls Mary the mother of God in this same speech. So I'll throw you a bone, right? Constantine, and as far as I remember, that's the first time I've come across that phrase of Mary being the mother of God. Maybe there were some earlier ones, but this is certainly an important one.
Well, think of what Constantine's doing. Before Constantine becomes a Christian, I don't believe the cross was seen as a symbol of Christ. Okay? So the fish was the symbol of Christ. There are other symbols. And Tom Holland explains it far better than I ever could, that it was so offensive in the Roman Empire because the cross was seen as the ultimate degradation of an individual. Okay, it was, and now you have Constantine coming out. That's radical.
That's radical.
Absolutely radical.
And I don't want to downplay that. It really is radical. And he really does say some very wonderful things about the crucifixion.
And so let's look at the Christian history from this point. We have three radical figures in Christian history up to Constantine. We have Jesus, the center. Paul's writings are very radical. And Constantine. I would say to people, understand the Roman history at this time, the power of the Roman Empire, and that cross, and then all of a sudden you have an emperor basically saying that the crucifixion was an important part of where we're at. And then what you see after Constantine is the cross now becomes a symbol of Christianity.
And Constantine's mom, shortly after this, will go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and find the true cross. I perhaps have my doubts whether she found the actual one. But anyway, she finds the true cross, and there are still relics to this day in various churches, I think Catholic and Orthodox, that have pieces of the cross that Constantine's mom found and claimed as the true cross. And so, again, that's sort of that crucifixion-centric mindset, too, that you can see there. And, moving on a little bit from the Council of Nicaea, we should probably try and wrap up a couple threads relatively quickly. Right. But Constantine, another thing that Constantine does is he moves the capital, right? This needs to be said. This is one of his most enduring things. Like I kind of mentioned earlier, Constantine didn't have a lot of connection to the city of Rome itself, right? He hadn't spent a lot of time there growing up. It wasn't really his home or any of those sorts of things. He had won a big battle there, but, he wasn't super loyal to the city of Rome. And the other problems that the empire was facing is that the frontiers were mainly with the Germans along the Danube River, right? Kind of in modern day, like Austria and Germany and stuff like that, Bavaria, more or less. And the other main front was in the east with Persia. And that Rome was kind of far away from those places. Rome wasn't actually a very good location to govern the empire. There are historical reasons, right? But that it was the Romans who ended up conquering. But if you were to start from scratch, you wouldn't maybe pick Rome as your capital. And so he has an ingenious plan. There's what's at this point a small city, a small, maybe large town or small city called Byzantium that is in a great location. But the problem is that in the ancient world, and this is still true to this day, to build a big city, you need good fresh water, right? And that basically meant that all big cities at that time were on a river, and normally pretty near where a big river met the sea. But the problem with Byzantium is that there's no river. It's on a peninsula, right? It's at the tip of a peninsula, and rivers don't normally go to the tip of peninsulas. They normally meet the water in a bay, right? But the Romans had a ingenious solution to this. They could build aqueducts. So with a little bit of infrastructure investment, you build an aqueduct kind of from the foothills near Constantinople that helps bring a good supply of fresh water down to the city of Byzantium. And now it can be much larger than a small town or a small city or a large town. It can become a giant city. And it's because it's on a peninsula, you can build a wall, right, protecting the peninsula from the rest of the continent. And basically, Constantinople gets the best wall probably in almost human history of all the walls that have ever been built. It gets a really good one. And it's also where two peninsulas come together, right? So it's a natural land bridge from Europe to Asia. And it's also part of the Bosphorus is where the Black Sea meets the Mediterranean Sea, more or less. So it's a big shipping route, and it's a big land trade route, right? Rome didn't really make sense as a trading route because, right, it was kind of, on the west coast of Italy. It didn't make sense as a major trading center. But Constantinople makes absolute sense geographically as a trading center, right, because it's a land bridge between two continents and it's a water bridge between two bodies of water at the same time. And it's very easily defensible. And so this was part of the genius of Constantine, was to move the capital over there because it made it easier to get to the Danube River and fight the Germans, and it made it easier to get to Persia to fight the Persians. And the eastern part of the empire was richer and more prosperous than the western part, so he recenters the empire further east. But, it takes a while for him to build this. And this is sort of part of what I'm saying about the kind of, it's a little bit hard to tell where Constantine's allegiances lie, because there are actually still a couple temples, pagan temples, that get built in Constantinople, even though there's churches that are bigger and more prominent. And right in the middle of the city, and I think this is just fascinating, to this day, this is one of the few monuments of Constantine that still exists. There's a giant pillar right in the middle of the city, like a big kind of Corinthian column. And on top of it is a giant statue of Constantine himself, in the nude, probably, in its original. And he has the garments and the head crown of Sol Invictus. So even after Constantine has supposedly converted to Christianity, even after the Nicene Council, after all of these things, after he's said nice things about Jesus dying on the cross, etc., when he goes to build a statue of himself in his new city, right in the middle of the city, to ever memorialize the fact that he built this city, here he is depicted in the likeness of the pagan sun god still. And it's like, what's with that? Is he and this is the thing that I think the best way to explain it is that when he had that vision before Milvian Bridge, I think he originally interpreted it as the sun god communicating to him, not necessarily the Christian God. And I think later he came to believe that these two gods were one and the same, right? basically, if you're a monotheist, there's only one monotheos, so all the monotheists have to agree about who that God is, right? You can't have multiple monotheisms. They're basically all the same. And he still viewed himself as, in some sense, being loyal to the calling he had been given by the sun god to be his agent of unification of the empire. And he still, even 20-ish years after his Christian conversion, depicts himself as the loyal agent of the pagan sun god.
Now to my Orthodox friends and Catholic friends, as Constantine finally winds up his life, he is baptized by an Arian bishop.
He is baptized on his deathbed, right? And one could say that this is a cynical thing to do. This was actually not entirely uncommon, even among Christians before Constantine, because there was this kind of belief that if you kept sinning after your baptism, that your immortal soul basically would be in danger, right? That sins after baptism could be judged more harshly, and you didn't have an easy path to forgiveness of those sins that happened after your baptism. So it was often considered a strategic thing to do to get baptized at the end, right? And then live the rest of your short life afterwards in good sinlessness, right? And then baptism was the sort of once and for all forgiveness, free pass of forgiveness of everything gone before. And so I think Constantine, knew that as emperor, he would have to do some ugly things like kill one of his own sons and kill other members of his family and do all sorts of the other ugly, necessities of running a global empire. And I think in some sense you could say, out of respect for Christianity, he does not get baptized because A, he knew that he would have to do some sinful things, and B, he knew that he didn't, in some sense, yet belong inside the church. Right. So, even at the Council of Constantinople, the Council of Nicaea and stuff like that, when they're having communion, he's not participating. When he builds churches and, inaugurates those churches and goes to Mass, he doesn't take communion, right? Until the very end of his life when he gets baptized, and then he finally takes communion. But the bishop who baptizes him was Eusebius of Nicaea, who was the leading Arian, right? Arius himself had long since been surpassed by other people who took his theological conclusions and were leading the movement. Arius wasn't really a leader of Arianism. He was just the person who got named after. The real leader at this time of Arianism is Eusebius of Nicaea, and that's the person who baptizes Constantine, is the leading Arian bishop.
So, again, in the history, what you see, for example, as a Catholic, right, one of the things that Catholics are taught for the Eucharist is that if you're in a state of mortal sin, don't take the Eucharist. You need to go confess it and have reconciliation and do penance before you take the Eucharist, right? This didn't come from nowhere. It's like, some Pope in 1500 did that? No. That was something that was inculcated right from the beginning of the church.
Even Tertullian, right? We can remember back to Tertullian. He recommended getting baptized later in life for this same reason, right?
Yep.
So, and that's like in the late 2nd, early 3rd century, right? And Tertullian was a hardliner, right?
Right.
So this idea of waiting late in life to get baptized was not invented by Constantine. In fact, he was in some sense respecting earlier Christian custom.
Correct. And here's the thing. What Constantine implicitly and what Tertullian said explicitly is, hey, sin's a big deal. Sin's a really big deal. Which is interesting because I think the Western Church, if you sin, Jesus will forgive your sins, right? And of course, my response is yes, he will, but there's also a worldly implication of what you've done.
Mm-hmm.
If you cheat on your wife, right? Jesus may forgive you, but your wife may not. It should not.
So I have another detail about Constantine's death
Okay.
that is interesting. So Constantine had been building a church in Constantinople that he intended to be his final resting place, right? And which it was for a while. This church eventually gets destroyed and his remains get moved. But right after Constantine dies, he gets buried in this church that he had more or less built for himself as such. And it was the Church of the Holy Apostles. And it had gathered relics from all, or at least all the ones that they could find of the 12 apostles, right? And so you have tombs, kind of reliquaries, I guess you could say, of the 12 apostles in this church. And above them, and they are pointing to, is Constantine's own requiem, right? Constantine's own reliquary, or Constantine's own resting place. And the symbolic message of this is that Constantine is more important than the 12 apostles. And that the 12 apostles are important, but Constantine is at a level above them. And Eusebius of Caesarea, right, his main propagandist and imperial theologian, will say things like, all of the prophecies that had yet to have been fulfilled by Constantine. And there are even some passages where it seems to almost imply that Constantine was something close to a second incarnation of the Logos. It's almost like Constantine was Jesus coming back, right? It sometimes gets within a hair of saying that the kingdom of earth, or the kingdom of heaven, has been inaugurated on earth by Constantine. And just as Jesus conquered the heavens, Constantine was the Logos conquering the earth and uniting it. And that the kingdom of heaven, the millennial kingdom, is here now. And Constantine is the agent. And the only person who could really be said to be more important in Christianity than Constantine is Jesus. But Constantine is even above the 12 apostles. And that is in the symbolic imagery in his own church that he built for his tomb. And so that, go ahead.
Let's leave it at that. That's a perfect way to end this, because I'm sure there will be a lot of comments, and it might be a good place to have a dialogue on our comments section, because I think, and I look forward to some of our Orthodox friends telling us what they think of that.
Yeah. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, it's hard to say that that's entirely wrong. You know, how long did Constantine's Byzantium kingdom last? Well, a little over 1,000 years. Who had more influence on Christianity, the apostles or Constantine? Who did more conquering for God, other than Jesus? Constantine seems up there. And it's one of those things where Constantine has these absolutely grandiose, and quasi-divine self-understanding, right? Mm-hmm. He has been chosen by God, who's kind of both the pagan and the Christian God at the same time, to accomplish a unique mission that only he can fulfill. That's a very grandiose thing to think about yourself, except for the fact that it seems to have come true, right? And I don't know. I sometimes don't know what to make of it, because there's part of me that's Protestant and does not like Constantine and does not like the after effects of Constantine. But I have to give the man credit. He did what he said he was going to do, and the full impact of what he accomplished is almost unmeasurably important.
Right, and very rarely discussed.
And very rarely discussed, because it's kind of awkward for everyone. It's awkward for the Orthodox in some sense. It's awkward for the Catholics. It's awkward for the Protestants. He's a singular figure that is hard to put in a box. And I think that he is too little understood, and people often use him for polemical purposes to make their own points instead of letting him be what he is. And he in some sense unified paganism and Christianity to abolish paganism and to establish Christianity as the official religion of Western civilization, and it still has been ever hereafter.
Absolutely. Well said.
Yeah. All right. Next week, or next time, Council of Nicaea, and then probably after that, Athanasius.
Your favorite saint.
My favorite. Yeah. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Talk to you later.